Good evening. China, the rise of China, I would argue, is the most important event in the world since the British Industrial Revolution. And it's going to change the world very profoundly. And it's going to change the world very profoundly in two ways, not one. It's going to change it economically, and I think we can already see this. And secondly, it's going to change it politically, intellectually, morally, spiritually, ethically, militarily, culturally. It's going to change the world in as profound a way, if not more profound way, than the rise of the West has over the last 200 years. Now, first of all, I want to talk about the economic side of it, because that's obviously very fundamental. The rise started in 1978, when China started to grow at about 10% a year. But when it started to grow at 10% a year, it was only 1/20th of the size of the American economy. So the impact of China, even growing at 10% a year on the world, was extremely small. But now China is over half the size of the American economy. And it's still growing very fast, between 7.5% and 8% a year. And it will likely continue to do so. This is the background. Now, there are, I know, it's fashionable, well, actually, I think that sort of the general mentality in the West towards China is what I would describe as a bearish sentiment. In other words, people are always expecting Chinese growth to, at some point, decline and, broadly speaking, as we've known it, end. That has been a constant refrain. And even now, you will have noticed since the financial crisis, a lot of the attention to China is, is it slowing down? Is it going to hit an economic crisis, and so on? Well, of course, China's got big economic problems, huge economic problems compared with what we've got. But the extraordinary thing about China is that since 1978, and it's difficult to know exactly why, but basically it's not had an economic crisis. It's carried on growing at 10% a year for over 30 years. Now, I want to emphasize that the impact of the Western financial crisis on the rise of China, or the relative position of China, to put it more precisely, has been to accelerate China's relative rise. This finishes a bit early. No, I should bring it up to date, but it's 2011. And it over on the left-hand side is the marked 100 is the size of the GDP of most range of Western countries in 2008. And you'll see by early 2011, most of them were still smaller than they were then. And Britain is still smaller than they were then. Now, and America is now a bit bigger, but not much bigger. Now we superimpose China over that period. And you can see China's been growing very rapidly in that period. The economy by 2011 was 1/3 larger than it was in 2008. Now, the effect of this process has been to accelerate China's relative rise compared with the situation in the West. And I don't think really, with all the sort of noise of the media, this is clear in people's minds, that this process has continued and accelerated. And one of the effects of this process is this. In the Goldman Sachs projections, which are widely quoted, I use it in my book, in 2007, it was projected that the Chinese economy would overtake the size of the American economy in terms of GDP by exchange rates in 2027. That was made in 2007. Now, the key figure here, the key thing to look at is GDP at market rates. This was put together by the economists, and it's a sort of consensus of what's happening. And you'll see all the red lines are where China's already overtaken the United States, and the blue lines are where it's still due to when it's likely to overtake the United States. And the purple line is GDP, and the projection now is that China will overtake the United States in terms of GDP by exchange rates, not in 2027, but in 2018, which is, in historical terms, just round the corner. We're very close to that situation now. And I would argue that actually what's happening now is that China is probably a more important shaper of the global economy, a more important shaper of globalization than the United States. And there are three footprints of China, economic footprints of China, I want to illustrate this point with. The first is, China is a huge trader. It's the second, almost now the biggest, but still the second biggest importer in the world, mainly for commodities. And you have all these commodities for which China's consumption is a very high proportion of global consumption. It is also a huge exporter. Overtook 2 or 3 years ago the United States, which had held the position for 110 years, as the largest producer of manufacturing goods in the world, and China is the biggest exporter in the world. And I just think these figures are so interesting. This is China as a trading partner of the combination of exports and imports of these various countries. Okay. And I've just summarized it. There's a great long list of them. But 1992, for Argentina, China accounted for 1.1% of the trade, of Argentina's trade. And then you'll see a dramatic change in Argentina's case. But what is fascinating is if you go back to 1992, apart from a number of East Asian countries, there were barely any countries in the world for which China was the biggest trading partner, hardly any. And now, now here being 2010, there are many countries for which China is the biggest trading partner. I mean, I don't know whether I've got a light here, have I? Yeah. I mean, Brazil, for decades, America was the largest trading partner. China's overtaken it. It's now 14%. America is around 10%. Obviously, Chile is China is its biggest trading partner. Venezuela, the United States it's either China or it's Canada. They're very close together. I'm not sure it's the largest trading partner for Russia, but I think it is now. And then for Pakistan, largest trading partner, India's largest trading partner, China. Egypt, not sure. Saudi Arabia, not sure. South Africa, China's the largest trading partner. All these East Asian countries and Australia. And this is steadily growing. I mean, this is a fantastic transformation in 20 years. And it's growing. I don't think it'll carry on growing as rapidly as it has because China's exports are not going to carry on growing as rapidly as they have because of the shift towards consumption. But nonetheless, the process will continue. Or take another measurement of China's rise, which is finance. I mean, in 2009 and 2010, between them, the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank were responsible for more lending to the developing world than the World Bank. The World Bank, one of the two great institutions of the post-war American world order. And one can see that in time, the World Bank is going to become relatively insignificant, probably, in global terms. It depends a lot on to what extent countries like China and to a lesser extent India and so on put their funds, their money into the World Bank, but I suspect that it'll be much more complicated than that because I expect there to be a different kind of international economic order as China develops along with other developing countries. But China is the key player, without any doubt, in this respect. Or a third area, which I'm not going to illustrate, but is the rise of the Renminbi. I mean, the Renminbi, very wisely, against all advice from the West, against the Washington Consensus, the Chinese did not make their currency convertible. Why? because they wanted to be able to control the development of the Chinese economy free from speculative movements which could derail or destabilize the economy. They never did it. Even now, it is not a convertible currency. Very wise. I assure you the Chinese policymakers are very smart. Very, very smart. And they made a very good strategic decision. But since 2008 autumn, they started to begin to make the renminbi available in the settlement of trade. In other words, paying for their exports and imports. So now it's responsible for quite a slice of its trade, quite a slice of the trade with Africa by China is done in the renminbi. And this is true for Latin America and so on. The renminbi is beginning to become an international currency. In time, down the road, it will become convertible. And when it comes convertible, I think it won't be very long before it displaces the dollar as the dominant reserve currency in the world. I'm not going to fix a time on it, but we're not talking about 50 years. We're talking about, well, it depends when they make it convertible, but within the next 20 years. Within the next 20 years. Maybe much less. I mean, it could be much less, but in my view, if the Chinese, I think, should tread cautiously in this respect. I think they've got other problems, other fish to fry before they start becoming a reserve currency with all that involves. Now, let's raise our sights a little bit more, okay? Let's push the boat out in time terms, the horizon a bit further, and look at these figures that have been compiled by Hu Hongong, who's at Tsinghua University, very good economist, very good economic statistician as well. And these figures are not so different from others that have been put together. But can I draw your attention here to China in 1820 accounted for 1/3 of global GDP. And then it had a horrific decline, what the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation. You see, and it hits bottom around the time of the 1949 revolution, 4.6% of global GDP, catastrophic decline. In fact, for over a century, Chinese GDP more or less froze, like India's actually, and then began to grow with independence, or in China's case, with its revolution. In India's case, with its independence. And then it starts going. Now, Hu Hongong's done these estimates for 2020 and 2030. These figures, by the way, are GDP according to PPP, primary product. So purchasing power, primary purchasing power, sorry. And look at 2030. And Hu Hongong's estimate is that by 2030, China will account for 33% of global GDP. Back, the future is back to the past, if you like, 33.4%. But what's equally fascinating here is America, 15.1%. In fact, its maximum achievement was 27.3. Well, actually, it was higher than that in the Second World War because so many European countries were relatively knocked out. But 15.1%, Europe 13.1%. You'll note this. China's economy in 2030, which is only 18 years or whatever it is down the road, 17 years down the road, will be twice the size of the American economy and over twice the size of the European economy. So, to proceed, I'll come back to that in a moment. This is what the global economy could look like in 2030. Japan just 3%, Russia 3%, Brazil 5%, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam and so on 6%, EU 13%, America 15%, India, which I haven't talked about, 19%, and China 34%. And if I paint the picture like this for you, the top one is GDP at current exchange rates, the bottom one is GDP at PPP, and the red ball is China, and the grey silver ball is the United States. And you'll see this extraordinary historical transformation. I mean, we're talking about only 30 years between the red ball being very, very small, almost like, not like the moon around the Earth, to becoming not yet the sun, but I mean much bigger than the American economy. And Danny Quah at the London School of Economics has put this interesting, done some very interesting work on trying to locate the epicenter of the global economy and how it's shifting. And in 1980, he had it, you know, in the Eastern Atlantic here. And then it steadily shifted. And at the moment, he suggests it's just here. And by 2050, he suggests it'll be on the Indian-Chinese border. This is this is an extraordinary historic shift that's taking place. You know, this was when the world was still dominated by the North Atlantic, in a sense. And this is how it is changing. And it's changing in another sense as well, just to go back to this. And that's this. Look, what characterizes this era is not just the rise of China. It's also characterized by the transformation in the position of the developing world. If you go back to the 1970s, the mid-1970s, the developed world accounted for 2/3 of global GDP, the developing world only 1/3. Bear in mind that 85% of the world's population lives in the developing world, and only 15% lives, roughly speaking, lives in the developed world. By 2000, it was roughly 50-50. Huang Gong's projection is that the developing world will account for 2/3 of global GDP by 2030. So the great transformation we're talking about, in which China is the leader, but is also the exemplar and is part of the wider phenomenon of the rise of the developing world and the decline of the developed world. That is the era that we live in. And the world is being and will be reconstituted by this process. In my view, we will see the existing international institutions either transformed or replaced, or both, is what I suspect will happen, is both. Because the new rising powers will want to constitute the world over time in a different kind of way. So that brings me to the end of my economic paration, because I want to move on and talk about China. What is China? You know, the economic stuff sort of enables us to think that China is very familiar to us and we know what it is and it's going to be like us. I mean, it doesn't, of course, we've got it wrong so many times. But there's a sort of ease of translation, or we think there's an ease of translation. Now, what about China as a country, as a history, as a nation? How to understand that? Now, the West has always thought, or has long thought, that there is only one modernity. And that modernity is a Western modernity. And that as countries modernize, they westernize. They become more and more like us. We're all on the upper escalator. We're just on different steps on that escalator. So as China modernizes, it will become just like us. This is an illusion. This is profoundly wrong. This is based on the assumption that somehow the process of modernization is simply a function of competition, markets, and technology. It is not. It is also a function of history and culture. China has never been Western. It is not Western now, and it never will be Western. I don't mean that it's not learning like crazy from us. I don't mean that it's not incorporated significant parts of that learning into what China is. But the end product will not be a Western-style country. It will be something different. Now, This is where we're all at sea, because we don't think like this. We think that Western concepts, Western ideas, drawn from our own history, drawn from our experience, can explain what China is. I'm sorry, it only has a limited capacity to do that. And I refer here not just to general, media stuff and so on. I refer to a lot of China scholarship by, China experts in the West. I mean, in varying degrees, but there are great exceptions like Lucien Pai, who I think was a great scholar of China, who was at MIT. Now, what I want to do, the main thing I want to do today, before I get onto the UK and where we're going to be, is to try and give you some building blocks for understanding China. And I'm going to give you, as quickly as I can, 5 key building blocks for understanding China. The first is this. China is a nation state. But it's only called itself a nation state for the last century, a bit more than a century. Anyone who knows anything about China knows that it is a lot older than a century. Over 2,000 years ago, with the victory of the Qin dynasty at the end of the warring state periods, you began to get the unification of China. And these are very crude maps, but this is roughly what the Qin dynasty looked like against the borders of modern China. The southern line of the red line is modern China. And if you go back, if you go on to the next dynasty, which lasted a lot longer, the Han dynasty, which is still, we're still talking about over 2,000 years ago. And there are the borders of the Han dynasty. So China has existed within, roughly, broadly speaking, its present borders. I mean, these parts of China were added much later under the Qing dynasty in the 17th century. The vast majority of Chinese live in this area then and now. Now, the fascinating thing here is this. China, the Chinese, the way the Chinese think of themselves, what it means to be Chinese, the way they think of what China is not a function of the last 100 years of being a nation state. It is a function of more than 2,000 years of being a civilization, or what I call a civilization state. China is primarily not a nation state. It is primarily a civilization state, and only secondarily a nation state. What am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about things like Confucian values, very unusual relationship, very unusual, unique, not unusual, unique relationship in many ways between the state and society. Very unusual conception of the family. Social customs like guanxi, ancestral worship, an ideographic language, Chinese food, chopsticks. I mean, all these things are not a function of the last 100 years. Now, here you have an absolutely basic difference between China and Western countries. Western countries are constituted on the basis, fundamentally or predominantly, varies from country to country, but always predominantly on the basis of national identity, on the basis of nation state. China is different. China is first and foremost constituted on the basis of civilization. It has absolutely far-reaching implications. You cannot understand the Chinese state without a concept of Chinese civilization and the civilization state. You cannot understand the Chinese attitude towards race, which in many ways is very different from what predominates in the West, without understanding this notion of Chinese civilization. I mean, the whole evolution of the Han as a concept, as a construct, as a race, and so on. So this is absolutely point of departure for understanding China. I'm going to give you one very, very quick example of this because I could go on. It's such a fascinating subject with what seems to me enormous implications. But Westerners don't really get it. Well, I did a talk in India. In fact, I did a series of talks in India. And India is very different from China, but they got it. They got it in a way that the Westerners don't get it. because we have no experience of this. But India has, and many other countries in the developing world have some sense of what we're talking about here. Now, remember 1997, handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China, and you may remember the Chinese offer was one country, two systems. And I don't think any of us really understood what the hell the Chinese were on, us being in the West, understood what the Chinese were really on about when they were making this proposal and what it would mean. I think we probably thought, well, when China gets its hands on Hong Kong, it'll just be like the rest of the People's Republic of China. It's just window dressing until they get their hands on it. Well, we were so darn wrong, weren't we? Because today, Hong Kong is as different from the rest of the PRC as it was in 1997. They meant it. They meant it. Why did we get it wrong? We got it wrong because we have a nation-state logic. What's a nation-state logic? One nation, one system. German unification after 1989. What happened? East Germany disappeared, reconstituted on the basis of West Germany, the new Germany. It was a perfectly logical way of doing it for Germany because Germany is a nation-state, but China is not a nation-state. China is primarily a civilization state. It is impossible to run a country of this extraordinary size and diversity on the basis of rule from Beijing, and everything is the same. It's a this is a continent. This has got 1.3 billion people. That province there, those four provinces together have a population larger than that of the United States. Those 9 provinces there each have a population larger than that of Britain or France. It is vast. It varies enormously, not just economically, but also politically, culturally, or in many different ways. The only way that China could run is on the basis of actually one civilization, several systems. So this has got enormous importance. Okay, I'll stop talking about civilization state now, but it's such an interesting subject, I'd like to carry on. The second example I want to take is about the family. Now, we think, often people in the West think, well, the process of the growth of individualism in society is a generic global trend, and every country will go in the same direction and become, in a sense, like we have done. And it is certainly true, that young Chinese, there's all sorts of, whatever I say about history, one's always got to remember that China is changing at the speed of light, and the gap between generations is enormous because they've been shaped by and conditioned by and generated by such different circumstances. But having said that, there are also extraordinary lines of continuity. And a key continuity is undoubtedly, notwithstanding the one-child policy and things like that, is the sheer importance of the family, one of the 2 great institutions in Chinese society. The family is nodal, pivotal in Chinese society in a way that it just isn't in the West, in any society anymore. How is it? Well, there's lots of illustrations I could give. The Chinese always write symbolically they write their name. The family name always comes before the given name. The family name is what matters, not the given name. Marriage is a union of families, not simply a union of 2 individuals. Chinese parenting, you may be familiar with this, but Chinese parenting is really significantly different from Western parenting. There's a very good book by Howard Gardner, the Harvard educationalist, on this. I think he must have adopted a Chinese kid or something because he spent quite a bit of time in China. And he draws the very strong differences. Chinese parenting is much more prescriptive. It's based on a much stronger notion of what is right and what is wrong, and the authority of the parent is much greater than it is in Western societies. Or the position of the elders, the seniors in Chinese society. By law as well as by custom, it is the responsibility of parents to look after and keep the elders of the family, the seniors of the family. And also, by the way, and this is not confined by any means to China, but it's common in East Asia, it is a shame shame-based culture, not a guilt-based culture. Western culture is a guilt-based culture. We need to save, we have to, Jesus Christ, was born on earth to save us from our sins. That is not the way in Chinese society or in Japanese society or Vietnamese society it works. It is based on shame, a question of losing face and so on. And you are socialized via the processes within the family. The Chinese essentially have a much more optimistic, and always have had much more optimistic view of human nature than Westerners. They don't think we're inherently sinful. They think if you're brought up in the right way by your family and by the educational process, there's no reason why you can't be a good person. So that's my second point about Chinese society. This is a fundamental difference, and whatever the enormous changes taking place, this will be in various ways, changing ways, mutating ways. It will remain, it seems to me, fundamental feature of Chinese society. Thirdly, China as a great power. Now, I suppose the assumption is, what will it be like? And the assumption, I suspect, that most of us have, well, somewhere or other, it will be like the United States. That it will exercise the same kind of the power in the same ways as the United States in a situation of global hegemony. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right. I don't mean they won't have anything in common, of course they will, but I don't think that's right. And I don't think it's right for the following reason. It is true that European and American society, Western societies, share with China a notion of universalism. They think that they both share, both aspects share, the idea that in some way or other they are a model for the world. But the way in which they interpreted historically being a model for the world was profoundly different. For Westerners, for Europeans, because we start with Europeans here, the Europeans interpreted universalism as a desire to expand across the world, to conquer territory, and to civilize the uncivilized, to project and convert their religion, Christianity. I mean, this was what the colonial empires that accounted for such a large percentage of the world from the late 19th century until the middle of the 20th century were about. Now, China's notion of universalism was very different. China's notion of universalism was the land under heaven, the Middle Kingdom, the most advanced civilization in the world. So why would you want to leave the land under heaven? Why would you want to step out? Chinese have a very strong sense of superiority. Why would you want to step outside heaven, the land under heaven, into darkening shades of barbarianism? So actually, China's notion of universalism was essentially a stay-at-home universalism. So, whereas we worship those, go to any British city and you'll find those who led colonial conquests and so on, their statues littered around the major cities. In China, that never happened. If you stepped outside and migrated, for example, to Southeast Asia, you were stepping outside civilization. You were not deserving the protection of the emperor. Very, very different historical tradition. So the Chinese had no empire. They didn't colonize. Well, the nearest they got to, you could argue that under the Qing dynasty, when they conquered these in the 17th century, that this was a form of colonial expansion. But it was on their own continent, and they never sought to colonize, for example, Southeast Asia and Indochina, which they could have done. Instead, they had something different. They had the tributary system, which I won't go into now, but it did not involve conquest of these territories. So this seems to me a fundamental difference between the experience of the Chinese and the experience of the West. The other difference is this. China's huge. China's got a massive population. Today, 1.3 billion people. It's a population 4 times the size of the United States. larger than the United States and Europe put together. It's a very difficult country to run. The problem facing all rulers of China in the imperial period and in the communist period is how the hell do you hold it together? Because when you've got a country that large with that big a population, the centrifugal forces are very, very powerful. And from time to time, of course, they've upset the Chinese apple cart, and they've gone through periods of very difficult conflict. So the priority of all rulers in China, and I envisage this to be true in the future, now and in the future, will always be first and foremost domestic rule, avoiding chaos. You know, the emphasis on stability and order in China is for a good reason. It's an extremely difficult country to govern. I mean, governing a little island like Britain, in comparison, is a doddle. Governing China is extraordinarily difficult. This is why, in many ways, the Chinese state, and I'll come to this in a moment, is so hugely competent. So, that's my second point, that China will be a different kind of third point, a very different kind of global power. My fourth point is about the state. Now, we think in the West, we get the Chinese state absolutely wrong, in my view, absolutely wrong. We think that the Chinese state is the Achilles heel of China. You know, why? Well, because it's not democratic. So it's got no legitimacy. We think that the legitimacy of the state is purely and simply a function of democracy. But if you look at these kind of figures, for example, from Tony Sachs' work, he's at the Kennedy School at Harvard, on levels of satisfaction, and they're borne out by the Pew Global Attitudes figures as well, for levels of satisfaction amongst the Chinese with their government. They're extraordinarily high. I mean, the left-hand column, the blue one, is central government, and you see credibility, legitimacy goes down the more and more local you become. But they are extraordinarily high figures, and the Pew figures are the same. Now, how do you explain this, given that China is not, in our terms, democratic? Well, I would suggest three ways of thinking about it. First of all, for the Chinese, the state has a very different meaning and a different relationship to society to the one we have in the West. For the Chinese, they see the state as the embodiment of what the country is. They see the state as the representative guardian of Chinese civilization. It goes back to the question of the civilization state. It's the protector of the unity. If you want to know why Mao, to this day, enjoys such prestige amongst the Chinese, much greater than Deng Xiaoping's ever achieved, even though he was the architect of the economic transformation, it was because Mao did something extraordinarily precious in the eyes of the Chinese. He put the country together again in 1949. He reconstituted the state as the central institution of Chinese society. And even though he screwed up left, right, and centre in all sorts of ways subsequently, for the Chinese, this made him, if you like, one of the great emperors. Now, the second reason that I think the consideration to understand the Chinese state and its relationship to society is that in Western society, we see the state in essentially utilitarian and instrumental terms. What would it do for me? If you think it's going to work, you vote for X. If you don't think they're going to do a good job, you vote for Y, or whatever it is. Now, the Chinese don't really see the state in those terms at all. They see the state in familial terms. They see, Confucius, writing 2,500 years ago, suggested that the model for the emperor was the father. The emperor should act like the father. It's obviously a patriarchal society. The model for the role of the emperor was the father in the family. And the Chinese view the state in familial terms. Now, this is so alien to our way of thinking, so profoundly different. But actually, it's not just true in China. In some degree, it's true in Japan, and it's also true in Vietnam, and it's true in Korea, in Confucian societies. Well, the last point, because I want to say it, but I haven't really got time to go into it, is I just want to say something about race, because no one ever talks about race, and it's so important, and it's very important to understand that you can never understand any society in the world unless you understand the process of its ethnic construction. And China is no exception to this. You know, you all know that China's huge, 1.3 billion people, but I bet you didn't know that over 90% of the Chinese think of themselves as one race, the Han. It's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. It's completely different from the next four most populous countries in the world, India, the United States, Brazil, and Indonesia. They are completely different. They all regard themselves to be multiracial, multicultural. But China doesn't really accept at the edges. Why? Because, well, how did the Han develop? How did this notion of the Han develop? How did this construction of the Han develop? Well, over a very, very, very long historical period. This is why the civilization state notion is so important to understanding the ethnic construction of modern China. If you want me to elaborate, I'll deal with it in questions. Okay, so I just want to, what I'm trying to convey here, I hope with some success, is that China ain't like us. I don't mean there's nothing in common. I don't mean we're all part of humanity. But its historical development is so different. And you've got to remember, you know, that we're very recent compared with China. I mean, China is the longest continuously existing polity in the world. Going back, well, arguably, it's one of the first, you know, one of the first settled with the Fertile Crescent, the first settled agriculture in the world. So China has a very, very long history. And maybe instead of people being surprised about China's rise now, this is the wrong way of looking at it. What we should be surprised about, maybe, is not the period since 1978, but what the hell went wrong between 1800 and 1949. Because for the most of the rest of the thousands of years of Chinese history, it was arguably one of, and often the most advanced country in the world. So you could say it is a return to what China is, and the Chinese think of it like this in many ways. We are returning to where we have always been. Now, and I would argue that this is that this process we're witnessing now, this historical shift, is one of those great historical trends which we don't really understand. That we can all offer some reasons for it, but we don't really understand why. I mean, we're still trying to understand how Europe rose and why China didn't rise at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. There's a long debate that keeps erupting and re-erupting about why that happened. Why did China not get it together at around the time of the Industrial Revolution? Because it was an advanced society at that point. I would argue that the shift we're seeing now is one of those great historical secular trends which we don't really understand the reasons for, but it is irreversible. Okay, it might go faster, it might go slower, but it will happen. And China will once more become, at least for the next 100 years, I'm not saying longer than that, but the next 100 years, the dominant country in the world. Now, what about us? How are we going to deal with this phenomenon? UK in a China-centric world. How are we going to deal with this huge paradigm shift? The great paradigm shift. What is it? That China will increasingly reshape the world, and the world will become increasingly unfamiliar to us. This is going to be a big shock for Westerners. Westerners have been highly privileged. They have the furniture of the world for 200 years has been their furniture. And and from a faraway part of the world, the furniture is going to, over time, progressively be transformed. Now, let me just catch my breath here, or rather catch my place. I think this is going to be profoundly difficult for us, because it's going to involve for Westerners, not just Britain, Westerners, such a big shift in attitudes. I mean, for long we've assumed that we're universal and that we're the model for others and that the world should be in our image, that we're superior, that we have nothing to learn from the developing world, really, that is essentially one-way traffic, that we are more advanced, we have a sense of entitlement, that it's our world and the global institutions are our institutions, be it the dollar or English language or the IMF or the World Bank, and the rest of it have been dominated by us. You know, it's been the West and the other, the West and the rest, Western primacy. Now, the rise of China is bringing that era to an end, or to put it in my terms, China is decentering and relativizing the position of the West. We are no longer universal. Our values are no longer universal values in the way that they previously used to be. Now the question is, how are we going to respond to this? And I'd like you to look at this quote from a very good American historian of China called Paul Cohen. And Cohen's argument, to make you feel a little bit pessimistic here, is that the West has long thought of itself as the most cosmopolitan of all cultures. But Cohen argues that this is wrong, that actually the West in many ways is the most provincial of cultures. And the reason he argues this is because the West has been so dominant for 200 years that basically it could get its own way by military might or by economic strength or, of course, linked to those by force of example. So it's never really had to take others on and respect others and deal with us on anything like the same terms. I mean, all America's relationships today, even today with China, have been based on American primacy. America has no equal relationships. All its relationships are unequal. That is the great advantage of being, or if you think it's an advantage, of being a great imperial power, a great hegemonic power. Now, Cohen's argument is what this means is that we are very provincial because we never really had to understand others. So we don't really get them. On the other hand, the vast majority of the world's population, those who live in the developing world, are in quite a contrary position. They have been obliged to know about us. They were forced to by colonialism. They had to make decisions about the extent to which they were going to be westernized, or on what terms they were going to be westernized, or often they had no real say in the process by which they were colonized, i.e. westernized. And so therefore, if you go to East Asia today, I'll tell you now, East Asians, whether they're Chinese or Japanese or Koreans or Vietnamese or whatever, have a much greater knowledge of the West than the West does of them. They understand it. They're bilingual or bicultural in a way that Westerners are not bicultural, except within the terms of ethnic diversity within their own societies. So this is Cohen's argument, and I think this is a sobering thought, because as we move into a world which requires us to have a very, very different kind of attitude, are we capable of developing that kind of mentality? Which is going to be necessary. And I have to say, the more I've thought about this, the more pessimistic I've become about it. I mean, if I look at Europe, it's clear the speed with which Europe's declining is very rapid. It's becoming marginalized. It has a provincial outlook, a provincial mentality. It's lost sight of the world. It doesn't have a map of the world. And it combines arrogance and ignorance. Arrogance towards, China, for example, that, it looks down on it, it lectures it, and so on, and ignorance. It doesn't even understand it. That is a toxic combination, a dangerous toxic combination for a culture that is going to be required to make enormous changes to itself. Now, we have, I think, two choices. One, I'm going to opt for the second. First, to retreat into our historical bunker, to close our eyes and put our fingers in our ears and pretend that none of this is happening. Keep trading with the same old markets. Did you know that Britain exports more to Ireland than it does to all the BRICS combined? China, India, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa. Carry on learning the same old languages. Well, we don't really learn. Unfortunately, we don't learn any languages much these days because we're so damn parochial. But you know, if you might learn, it depends on what schools you go to. But you know, French, German, Spanish, Latin, ancient Greece. Still extremely difficult to learn Mandarin at a British school, state or private. Still extremely difficult, let alone a language like Hindi and so on. But I'm obviously talking here essentially about China. We can carry, I mean, I think this is a wonderful illustration of the problem. These are the flights of British Airways, okay? So, and this shows you where we lean. These are the flights. So look at the number of flights to America, okay? Now look at the number of flights to China, or the whole of, I mean, across Asia, and there's obviously loads of flights to Europe, and that I think is a very interesting expression of the kind of problem that we face. And you know, we can carry on lecturing the Chinese, telling them how to do this, and I mean, they so deeply resent it. I mean, I'm not saying that what we've got to say has no value, is not important. You know, the question of Tibet, the question of a Dalai Lama, but the Chinese hugely resent it because, you know, they're a country that were colonized and deeply resented this colonization. So, and the Chinese are very proud people. And I understand this. I understand that, even though on the handling of Tibet I disagree with. But I understand what the Chinese pushback on that. And, you know, there's a sort of, well, anyway, enough of that. The second point, now, that's one choice. The other choice is, you know, a completely different mentality. But are we capable of it? I mean, of course, some people are capable of it. I look around, I know people, they are already doing it. They're already showing this kind of inclination. But as a culture as a whole, are we capable of engagement, curiosity, humility, contrition, understanding China on its own terms, an openness to a different culture that at the moment we don't understand, but we need to understand? Are we going to learn Mandarin? I mean, I think that every primary school should teach Mandarin. Every primary school should teach Mandarin. It's going to be absolutely fundamental to operate in the modern world to learn Mandarin. We need to prioritize the Chinese market. We need to welcome Chinese capital. We need to welcome Chinese students. They are a terrific investment for our future, as opposed to treating them like an immigration statistic that we need less of. And above all, a willingness to learn. You know, for the last 30 years, essentially China's, the traffic has been mainly, or in the early period, exclusively one way. China learning, not just from the West, but certainly learning a lot from the West. But that picture is going to change, and is already starting to change now. I mean, let me give you some examples. This is the OECD Global Survey of Education. It was published at the end of 2010, and it's the performance of 15-year-olds in all sorts of countries around the world, science, reading and maths. And you'll see top in every case was Shanghai. Not just top, but well clear on the PISA marks. And then if you look at the next countries, well, frequently they are, what should we say, broadly speaking, Confucian-based societies. You can see I lifted these from America because America's headline there. Now, you know, why is it that these societies, especially in the Shanghai case, how do they do it? These are deep questions, and we've obviously got a hell of a lot to learn because, you know, there's old dear Britain there, for example. I've just spotted her. And can you even see Britain here? Down? Thank you. And here, go on, help. Up. Okay. Yeah, there you are. Okay. Well, okay. You helped me make the point. So, and I think education, we think that the Chinese, they learn everything by rote and so on. I'm not saying the Chinese don't need to learn things from us, but that's not the point. Do we, because they know that, do we need to learn from them? Of course. What do we need to learn from them? Above all, the central element is the recognition in Chinese culture, coming from, I think, from Confucianism essentially, of the importance of education. Education is regarded with reverence in China. It is the way to transform your family's prospects in China. This is a very, very long Chinese tradition. So if you can get your kid into Tsinghua or Peking University or Renmin University or Sun Yat-sen University, one of the top universities in China, you know, it transforms the prospects for your family. And so there's this enormous recognition. And the agents for this are the parents. And the Chinese parents have a very, very high expectation of their kids. And it's not just within China, but you'll find it with Chinese parents here or around the world. It's true of the diaspora. They have a very high expectation that their kids will do well at school. They require them to do well at school. And they are right, broadly speaking. I mean, I'm not saying every way it always happens is the right way, but broadly as a cultural attitude, this is very, very positive. Or take infrastructure. I mean, belatedly in Britain, we're just recognising that infrastructure might be important. The Victorians, of course, did know this. But the Chinese are showing how to do it. And, you know, they are the masters of infrastructure. I mean, if we want to get things, HS2, whatever it's called, done quickly, well, the Chinese will probably do it for us in a year. Look at their high-speed rail network. Their high-speed rail network is the largest in the world and will shortly be larger than the rest of the world put together. They know how to do infrastructure. Or the Chinese state. You know, I didn't finish my point about the state. The Chinese state is extremely competent. It is based on a meritocratic system which goes back to Confucianism. I think it is far more competent than Western states. We don't talk about competence, we talk about democracy. I'm not belittling democracy. But what is also extremely important is the state fit for purpose? Can it lead society? Can it provide... Well, now, we've been through a whole era of neoliberalism where we belittle the state. We didn't think we needed the state. Everything could be privatized. The market sorted everything out. This is also nonsense. And the consequences have been very severe in all sorts of ways. But the Chinese have not made that mistake. And the Chinese state is extremely important. We can learn so much. In the 19th century, early 19th century, of course, Western societies did look to the Chinese state to try and learn things about how it should work. China is the home of statecraft. China is the home of Confucius, the first great theorist of governance. So I finish by saying this. My last 3 points are just headline points. And they are, one, what does the future mean for us? The future means that we're all going to have to become, in the next era, a little bit Chinese. Just like in the 19th century, willy-nilly, the world was required to become a little bit Western, or in those days, a little bit European. Because you had to learn from the most advanced area of the world, and you had to also, you know, and that was where power resided and so on. Secondly, the future of Western modernity as Western modernity in a sort of purist form, if I can put it so crudely, is bleak. Western modernity needs to become a hybrid modernity. It will have to learn from what is happening in East Asia, and it will have to learn, above all, from what is happening in China. Now, I just say to you that all East Asian modernities are really hybrid modernities. They have had to learn from the West. we will have to start thinking in a much more open and pluralistic ways as us. And my third and final point is this. This is not just a matter of governments. It is a matter for every institution in society, whether it's a university or a company or even a charity. They will have to think, what do they need to be in the new China-centric era that we're moving into? And the same goes for every individual one of us. How do we deal, respond, equip ourselves, equip our children for this new era that we're moving into? And if we don't, well, you know, we're just going to be marginalized. And that's what the Chinese did. The Chinese, at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, they thought we'd got nothing to learn from Britain, we've got nothing to learn from the Industrial Revolution, we can just ignore it. And what happened? 150 years of marginalization, occupation, civil conflict, and poverty. Thank you.
My name is Adibek. I'm from Imperial College. I'm an undergraduate studying life sciences. My question is, why do many rich Chinese people go to the West nowadays? Thank you.
Well, I mean, it's not just rich people. I mean, lots of Chinese have been like to come as tourists, and there's been a steady, and quite a few Chinese students, when they finish, if they can, will stay on for a period. I mean, that's certainly been true in America. But you're right that, you know, that one phenomenon is that some rich Chinese settle, and some silt their money out of China in illegal capital flow because they want to hedge their bets, and they can afford to hedge their bets. They've got the power to hedge their bets. So why is it? I think I think Chinese young people go abroad out of curiosity. I mean, you know, I don't think they're any different from, in that sense, from young people the world over. You know, if they got the possibility of doing it. Remember, this generation of Chinese is basically the first generation in large numbers that can do that. And for the rich Chinese, well, I think that you know, they're still wary of lack of property rights. They know there's a lot of resentment in China against rich people, and a fair amount of that resentment is probably not misplaced, because they think that there's a common assumption in China that amongst a lot of people that the Chinese have, you know, the Chinese rich have done it through forms of corruption and so on. So they, you know, if they can afford it, they'll have a place, a property in London, or, you know, a property in Beijing and a property somewhere else, and so on. So I think there's a complex of reasons for it, but I don't think it's not a dramatic trend. I mean, it's nothing like Russia, you know. It's nothing like the Russians, where, you know, I mean, the problem with Russia is, you know, was exactly how not, you know, the passage from a centralized system to a more liberal system with the market and so on, in China and Russia has been completely different. I mean, Russia was extremely corrupt, and people like Abramovich, and, you know, they all got their positions through where they were and who they knew. It was a very nepotic consequence, and it's done, you know, at a tremendous cost. And, you know, they needed to know someone in the Yeltsin family to do it. This was the critical period. Whereas China's not been like that in anything like the same way. Of course, there is corruption in China. It's quite rife. It is a serious problem, but it's not derailed the transformation of China, and I don't expect it to.
Alice Gosling, managing marketing at Jacques. The luxury market reached an all height a few years ago, and it's now all of a sudden managing a decline. What are your predictions for the luxury market in China over the next decade?
No, I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to pontificate about something I don't know. I mean, you know why it's going down at the moment, probably, don't you? I mean, Xi Jinping is having a big assault on what he regards, what he argues, he's right actually, I think, extravagance by state-owned companies, by party officials and so on, you know, campaign against, you know, a party official is only nominally earning, or government official is nominally only earning X amount of money, but is wearing a watch that would take him 10 years to buy. And it's a great thing on Weibo, you know, the equivalent to Twitter in China, you know, they take photographs of this official wearing this, you know, how did he afford it, and so on. So that's the reason. I think that's a good, that has got to be in principle a good thing. But you know, the luxury market is going to carry on in the long run rising. Of course it is. You know, China, the whole country in varying degrees has got much, much richer. Virtually everyone, I think, in varying degrees has enjoyed this. I mean, wage levels in Beijing have gone up. Well, basically real wage levels for the Chinese have increased at the same rate over the last 10 years as the growth rate. That is, you know, that you're doubling your living standards every 7 years. And if it's 7 or 8%, you're doubling them every 10 years. So, and then those are at the top end are doing the best. You know, so I think you're okay. But hopefully not quite like it's been.
Mary Wheel, I'm Imperial College Business School. I was really interested in what you had to say about the Chinese government's competence. And I wanted to sort of probe that a bit more. I mean, we know they've got the scope and power to do things like the Three Gorges Dam and clear 1.3 million people out of the way to do it. But is that really competence? And will we hear about their incompetence? Is their society open enough to really make that judgment? I'm sure you know more about it, and I was just wondering if we we are actually in a position to make that judgment.
Well, I think it's a good point, and I think what we can see is what they've achieved. I mean, you can't argue with this extraordinary, you know, the high-speed rail network. You can't argue with the economic transformation of China, the speed at which it's happened. Now it's rapidly rising up the value chain. I mean, have you been recently to China?
No, but in my defence, when I say I'm starting Mandarin lessons on Tuesday.
Setting everyone an example. Very good. No, I didn't ask you that. I mean, one of the things is when people go to China, they often, you know, they never have the same view again when they come back, because it's in your face, the transformation. You just can't. It's just extraordinary. I mean, it's, you know, it's got an extraordinary power. What's happened, and you. I mean, that's happened to me. I first went in 1993, and it was elemental compared to what it is now. So there's all those measurements. Now, the question is, what is the cost of it? That's your question. You know, if they build the Three Gorges Dam, or when they do the high-speed rail network, what happens to the farmers or the people who live in the way of it, and etc. And are they heard? And I think you'd say, well, they didn't used to be heard, but they're making themselves heard now, because China is becoming a more complex society. People are acquiring a voice. The internet has transformed the possibilities of argument. I mean, I was in China in, I think it was 2010, the summer of 2010, at the time of the high-speed rail accident in, where's my Chinese friend, in, where was it? Wenzhou? Wenzhou. And initially the press gave anodyne versions. The first day or two, the press gave anodyne versions. You know, official Ministry of Railway kind of handout. Ministry of Railway is an extremely powerful institution in China, or was, and was a law unto itself. It had its own police force and everything, you know. And then the internet, you know, then people started to talk about it on the internet hugely. And within a few days, the whole position of the Chinese government shifted, and they closed the whole nationally, the whole high-speed rail network, while they investigated what was the cause of the accident and so on. Now, that wouldn't have happened 10 years earlier. And so I think the answer is, well, the Chinese get away with things that you'd never get away with here because the priority is different. You know, when you're a very poor society, you're willing to accept a different reckoning to when you're a richer society. And the equation will change in China over time as well. But the state is still extraordinarily competent. It's a very, very competent institution. I mean, you know, quite frankly, the architect of China's, I mean, the transformation of China is to do first and foremost with the Chinese people, you know, and the attitude of the Chinese people, their willingness to work, extraordinary industry, and their willingness to learn, and the standards they expect of themselves. I mean, I think that always really impresses me about the Chinese. And not just men, but women. Women, above all, I think, symbolize, urban young women symbolize the transformation of China. And so, but if you ask, well, what is the architect of the transformation? The architect of China's transformation is the Chinese state. And so we have to treat the Chinese state, I think, this is the greatest economic transformation in human history. So we have to treat the achievement of the Chinese state in this respect with extraordinary respect. And we can learn a great deal from them, even though we ourselves are confronted with very different circumstances.
Richard Adams, talent marketer and life sciences consultant. I just wanted to pick up on the education, the drive for education, and those Chinese who are taking advantage of the Western organisations, such as the one we're present today. And as these young Chinese go through Western education, the influence that they will have, and in what direction that may take the state. I've one or two examples. I was talking to a friend of mine from Australia. I lived and worked in Australia for many years, and there's a lot of Chinese there who are good examples of what you say about making the most of the education system, doctors or lawyers or what have you. But this friend of mine who's been working with the Chinese and big engineering construction projects was telling me about 3 weeks ago when I met him in Italy that the time will come for change, with a lot of Chinese who are outside of China biding their time. And I was very interested in this, and I could go on in terms of comparisons with India versus China, but I've been very interested in your comments on that. Really, my question is, how do you see the influence of Western educated Chinese on the future direction of the state?
Well, I mean, the most obvious effect they have is, you know, the benefits they get from their education in Western institutions. They can, when they go back to China, then it helps to enrich the knowledge base and the skill base of China. I mean, that's the most important. That's why they've been encouraged to go. And now, because the government used to pay for it, but now lots of families can afford to do it, and that's what they do, and that's what they do here, I assume. So I think that's the most. That is very important. Secondly, we've always got to remember that a lot don't go back. This has been a pattern not just for China. Korea is often the example that's cited vis-a-vis the United States. Most Koreans didn't go back. Then they did start going back. And the Chinese have been working very hard to persuade them to come back because their economies reached a stage where they really need these people and so on. So they're offering, as you may know, in your field, very large incentives for Chinese academics who stayed in the States or something like that, to come back. To what extent will they're educated in the West, will they take Western ways, which I think is probably the thing that's most on your mind, Western idea, Western politics, Western, I suspect not much. Now, this is a common assumption that you come to the West because you're going to go native and you're going to go back and you're going to make Chinese society like the Palace of Westminster. And I don't.
That there's a sort of a critical mass where you get enough people who've been exposed to a Western society.
Well, it doesn't necessarily
to raise, to question the old ways.
Yeah, definitely, but not necessarily in ways that we would think. That they don't necessarily go. I mean, of course, they all go back thinking a bit differently, in some way or another, but not necessarily thinking like we do. It's a mutation rather than they're radicalized by Western ideas and they go back and the Western dream, we need it in China. I don't think it works like that. I'm not saying it doesn't work for anyone like that, but I don't think that's generally the way it works. I mean, the Chinese kids that I know that have been in the West, they often, characteristics of the Chinese here. Chinese tend to I expect it's true at the university here, the college here, they tend to mix a lot amongst themselves. And this is a universal, everywhere I see Chinese students, this is a very, very strong characteristic. And they, and the family remain, even if they don't go back, the family will remain very important, and the sense of being Chinese will remain extremely important. And the other thing to bear in mind is, if I was Chinese, I understand the seduction of living in a richer society. If you live in a richer country, it's difficult to go and live in a poorer country afterwards. I think this is quite a common human characteristic. But if I was Chinese, I'd think, well, do I really want to stay here in Britain or America, or do I want to go back to China, where the opportunities are clearly so much bigger than living in a stagnant, declining culture like our own? I mean, I'm not exaggerating. That is what we live in my view. And so I think that the attraction for going back to China is very, very strong. But some people don't. I know lots of Chinese who've gone. I've got a friend, and she looked after my son when we were helped look after my son, and she was a graduate of Tsinghua. She was an architect, and she's now living. She married a Chinese and I think he works in America and is in California, and she's living there now. And she said, "We're going to stay here a while, but we will go back." She said one day. And I think that's fair enough.
I'm Adam Knight, a student in Chinese at the University of Oxford. I'm representing a new organisation called British Sinophile. I was just wondering whether you could comment on how China's increasing importance in world affairs will affect how the UK conducts its foreign policy. I'm thinking kind of particularly about the EU question that's going to be kind of gaining momentum over the next couple of years, and how what we do here in the UK and what we do abroad will affect our relations with China.
What's on your mind in particular when you mention the EU?
Well, in particular, the kind of idea that if we, and this has been reiterated by other countries such as America and Japan, if the UK were to leave the EU, would countries such as China, Japan, America have the time for us when it came to bilateral relations? Just kind of...
I think the answer is quite straightforward. Because I heard one of the Chinese leaders who was over here, and he was asked this question by the head of KPMG, I think it was. It was a dinner in the evening, and what are the prospects for can Britain? The question he asked was, can Britain become because he's quite very interested in China and the possibilities. Can Britain become the sort of bridgehead, Chinese bridgehead in Europe? So we would be the conduit for China's rise in this region and influence. And the answer was quite simple. He said, if you leave the European Union, the answer is never. Simple as that.
Kind of, sorry, I'm talking it, but kind of in addition to that, just thinking, how would you mentioned when you were talking about, how we should kind of almost keep some of our opinions to ourselves and not lecture the Chinese when it came to things like Tibet. And like you said, we might think that what we're saying is right, but sometimes it's better to kind of keep quiet when it comes to that. Is that something that you would kind of advocate to
keep quiet?
Well, I'm thinking kind of, for example, last year when David Cameron and Nick Clegg met with the Dalai Lama, and that kind of put us on a ministerial deep freeze when it came to China relations. When it comes to difficult issues such as human rights, Tibet, global warming, whatever, should the UK and other countries look to promote themselves and trade, or should we speak up?
Okay, just one rider to what I said to you about Britain and Europe. Listen, the country that matters to the Chinese in Europe is Germany. The Germans have played a long strategic game. They recognise the importance of China. They also never made the mistake that we made of running down manufacturing. So for the Chinese, Germany is an extremely important partner. The Germans have got a strategic partnership with the Chinese, which is going to be very, very important in the future for Germany. And so, if we're not even we've not been strategic in our relationship with China. We haven't placed a priority on the importance of the relationship with China. We're laggards. So it's not just a question about the European. We just haven't done it. And this bunch that we've got now. Excuse my rather dismissive attitude towards them, but they just don't understand the world, in my view. They just don't clock it. But then that's the danger of being educated in elitist institutions that are still deeply embedded in a long ago history.
Peterborough Nuclear Information Service. I wonder whether you could give us your views on how you think the Communist Party will evolve and change as China develops over the next 20 or 50 years.
Well, I could say I don't know, which is true. It's a difficult question to answer because it has changed enormously. It's not what it was. It used to be a kind of campaigning, mobilizing organization in Mao's time. And now it is essentially a sort of administrative, it's the administrative core of the Chinese state, used for, it is the Chinese state. That is what, in effect, that's what it's become. It's huge, and it's got a cross-section of great talent within Chinese society. The question is, can it keep renewing itself? If it ossifies, then it will get into trouble without any question whatsoever. Now, the interesting thing about the Chinese Communist Party is that it has actually been quite good at renewing itself, unlike the Soviet Communist Party. When the Soviet Communist Party came to try and renew itself, it was too late. Gorbachev was too late. And what Gorbachev did, I supported Gorbachev at the time and greatly admired him, but looking back on it, he was wrong. That wasn't the way to do it. It was a kind of big bang. And the difficulty that the Soviet Communist Party, I think, always had was that it never had real popular roots. The Russian Revolution was based in the cities. The cities, only a very small part of the population lived in the cities. So in the countryside, it didn't have, it had weak roots. So therefore, every time it tried to do something like collectivization, there was a very, very, very strong element of force and brutality involved in it. And that's in a way what Stalin was about, forcing the policy on the Russian people. Now, the Chinese are in a very different situation. Their support was not in the cities. That was where the Kuomintang had the support. Their support was in the countryside. This was, the significance of the Long March, the guerrilla warfare against the Japanese, and so on. So the Chinese Communist Party built up great support in the countryside, where the vast majority of Chinese live. That's where Mao's support came from. It came from the countryside, not from the cities. And I think that the difference between the Russian Communist, Soviet Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party was the Chinese Communist Party had deep roots in Chinese society and a lot of popular support. And that is, I think, for me, that's the nearest I can get in my mind to explaining why it was that the Chinese Communist Party could make the extraordinary shift it did after Mao died to Deng Xiaoping. I mean, it's very difficult for a political organisation to make that kind of change. You've got to be extremely self-confident, and I think deeply rooted in society, to have the confidence to suddenly basically say, you know, they didn't say it like this, but this is what it meant. We got that wrong. We're going to do it like this. And they did it with remarkable success. Now, whether that process will carry on, you know, whether they could do it again, you know, keep renewing itself, you know, we'll see. I mean, there's a very, very strong emphasis in the Chinese Communist Party on meritocracy. Well, this is Confucian tradition. Meritocracy, promoting the best, etc. And there's no question that, you know, if you meet Chinese officials and so on, a lot of them are extremely competent. Now, a fair number are also corrupt, but, you know, they're very competent. So can they do it? Now, there's an interesting TED talk that I would draw your attention to by Eric Lee, who's a young Shanghai. He's a venture capitalist, actually. So he's made a lot of money, but he's also a rather interesting intellectual. And in this talk, Eric, and in this talk, you know, he argues, and I think it's an interesting argument which we're going to have to take seriously, which is, you know, why that system of government is better than ours. I'm not saying that I agree with that in that either-or sense. I think it's more complicated than that. But it's an interesting and robust argument he presents about why the Chinese tradition of meritocratic government is better than the Western system. You know, he quite rightly points out that the people who become prime minister or president or whatever it is in the West have no training for the job and prove it time and time again. You know, but we think it's a good idea because we want them to be accountable. You know, that's the strength of the strength of our system is accountability. Their weakness is incompetence. And so it's a very interesting argument. Now, in the longer run, this is what I think is going to happen in China. It will carry on getting, because it's big changes already over the last 20, 30 years, it will become more and more transparent as it is becoming, more and more accountable. In certain respects, the way they do it, they'll do it in their own way, but more and more representative. That process will continue. I suspect that that the Communist Party will become more and more open over time. I mean, I'm not predicting next year or 5 years, but it will become more open because that's fundamental. You can't have those other things without that happening. And in that sense, Chinese society will become more democratic. Will it have a multi-party system? Well, even if it does have a multi-party system, I think it'll operate very differently from the way our system works. Because the tradition of the role of the relation of the state, it's like Japan. You know, we think, oh, Japan's like us, okay, it's democratic. I don't think that's true at all. It's true it has a multi-party system, and it's true it has universal suffrage, but actually it has extraordinary continuity. And the people who run Japan are the state bureaucracy and have run it, you know, historically. That's how it's been run. And the reason is because, you know, Shintoism is derived from Chinese traditions and so on, similar, not dissimilar traditions from Confucianism or adaptations of Confucianism and so on. So there's a strong tradition in these societies that there is not a tradition of popular sovereignty. There is a tradition of state sovereignty. And I think that's a very deep part of Confucian type societies. It doesn't mean they can't become more democratic, but even if they, you know, like we think of democracy, but even if they do, they'll still operate in a way that's very different from the way we operate because the whole culture and history is so different. That's what makes the world so interesting. Not that it's all like us, but there are so many different things. And then sometimes societies and cultures rise, and sometimes they fall. So China is now rising, we are declining. China's rise will not be forever, Because what will happen? How will China's period in the sun come to the end next time? The same as it historically always has come to an end. This is an extremely difficult country to run because it is so large. When the stars are aligned, the centripetal forces are much stronger than the centrifugal forces. When the stars get out of alignment, the centrifugal forces outpower the centripetal forces, and China goes into disarray. This has been the story of Chinese history, and I've got no reason to believe it won't happen in the future. Thank you.